I'm very pleased to introduce you all to Ozzy Rasbani Tehrani. She has 25 years of combined experience in clinical and community practice in Ontario. She is a professor, researcher, psychotherapist, and consultant that has worked in different capacities with individuals, couples, and families across diverse communities. For over 10 years, Ozzy has been in private practice with individuals and families. And her clinical work experience includes supporting individuals, couples, and families in different dynamics, including folks involved in the criminal justice system, women and children in crisis, as well as folks from vulnerable communities. Her community experience includes developing and implementing programs and services for youth, for example, bullying prevention programs for 2S LGBTQ+ support groups, as well as adults, for example, substance use and anger management programs. Currently, Ozzy is the clinical director at MindCo Mental Health and Wellness Boutique, where she engages in clinical practice and consultation, as well as oversees programs and services offered to individuals and businesses. Please join me in welcoming to the podium Ozzy Rasbani Tehrani.
Hello, so nice to be here with everyone in person and also virtually. Good afternoon, evening, morning. Some of you may be connecting from different parts of the world. So it's just such an honor, and I'm just so humbled to be here and talk about such an important issue to me and of course our profession. I'm not gonna pretend like I have all the answers because boundaries is an ongoing discussion. It never ends. My message today is consult, consult, consult. So it's just a fascinating discussion that forever evolves. The other piece I wanted to say is that just to kind of begin with, you know, boundaries is an issue that really not only touches clients, service users, but also us as professionals. So I think that it's important to have dialogue about it, and as previous sessions mentioned, if we're not having a conversation about it, then a lot of this would be hidden. So a complex issue, but yet an important issue to discuss. Definitely of utmost importance. This issue is personal to me because in my practice, I've really supported a lot of folks that have been violated in many ways by professionals. And I'm not just talking about social workers or social service workers, but other professionals as well. But somehow there's this additional layer of, I feel, accountability for us because as social workers or social service workers, because often folks come to us at their vulnerable point. So that's important to remember. But again, this is good for our own professionalism as well as personal well-being. So I just wanted to reiterate that. Starting with just kind of a bit of definition around boundary issues. Boundary issues are essentially disruptions of expected and accepted social, physical, and psychological boundaries that separate clinicians as well as service users. Boundary issues that we're mainly focusing on today is boundary crossings and boundary violations, which can be distinct but overlapping, and we'll speak more to that. So two type of boundary issues that, as I mentioned, we're going to cover today is boundary crossings. So a boundary crossing is essentially a deviation from classical therapeutic activity that can be harmless, non-exploitative, and possibly supportive of therapy in itself. But it can also be quite harmful, and we talked in other sessions about the slippery slope, because some things are distinct. They're quite, explicit, predatory behavior and refraining from that. But other things can get quite complex. So it's imperative to recognize that a lot of times a boundary violation does begin with a boundary crossing. So being mindful of that. And actually the literature shows that as well, right? That it starts with boundary crossing. So an example of a boundary crossing could be practitioner is invited to attend maybe a client's high school graduation, right? A lot of times, you know, I've had that happen working with young people and supporting young people, you know, for a lengthy period of time, and they invite you to be a part of that celebration. And so just being mindful of many things, and I'm going to speak more to that later on in terms of things to watch out for. In contrast, a boundary violation is harmful and potentially is harmful to the service user and the therapy process, because it is such an important, fragile process in itself. I have some examples, and this is not an inclusive list, of course, but practitioners, examples of boundary violations is practitioners engaging in social activities with clients. So maybe let's connect and go to a bar together, or social events like that. Or it can be having an intimate or sexual relationship with a client, because we know that no matter what the situation is, as professionals, we need to refrain from that. And I always like to err on the side of caution. So I know that our Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice has, you know, different guidelines around, you know, therapeutic practice with individuals, but also social service or community practice where there's a time frame and you may be able to engage in that. For me, it's a no all across the board. It's just, I guess it relates more to my personality and being conscientious, because I've seen some of the harm that's done to folks that I've supported in the past. A big one that I often struggle with is actually having family members or friends as clients. And sometimes it links to cultures. I know that for my culture, a big part of, you know, going to a therapist, going to a helper is knowing them, right? They're recognizable in the community. They're trustworthy. But yet, again, the onus falls on us to protect others, even if it's family, even if their intentions are good. Because I find myself so much thinking 2, 3, maybe 6 steps ahead of what could potentially go wrong, right? So even though it's an honor for folks in the community to reach out, to, you know, get supports, still something that we need to consider, because there are all kinds of potential violations and harms. So in other words, a client should not be a lover, a relative, an employee, employer, colleague, teacher, business partner, or friend, right? Even though sometimes friends do reach out as well to kind of say, well, we know you, and it just feels right that, you know, you get involved and support us. It's just to watch out for them and protect them and their privacy and well-being. That's an important piece to consider. So boundary crossings versus boundary violations can occur both ways. It can occur from service users, clients, towards practitioners or clinicians, as well as from clinicians towards clients and service users. And as I mentioned again, watching out for that slippery slope, because often it's the boundary crossings that gets complex and leads to boundary violations. And it's so important to think about boundaries and the cultural nature of boundaries. This is fascinating, and this came out for me in interacting with clients or service users, right? Where boundaries are culturally and societally driven, right? So, for example, the way we protect the confidentiality and privacy of service users or clients in Canada may differ than other parts of the world. And that's an important consideration. I had a client I was supporting shared with me about previous concerns of practitioners in another part of the world releasing private information to parents, other family members. And so just kind of being mindful of that. And yes, it's important to be culturally sensitive, but I think for me, at the end of the day, what I keep in mind is that we are in Canada and we're working with Canadian laws, we're working with our ethics in the province of Ontario. So going back to that, and whenever feeling that if, you're not sure of something, to always consult. I know that one of the huge resources for me is our regulatory body, OCSW, SSW, right? Because they're such a great resource. So I know that I'm quick to email or call and see if there's any resources or guidance when things come up, but as well as other colleagues, right, to bounce off ideas from, with peers and other kind of professional development. So why is it important to establish and maintain boundaries for clients? Many reasons, some of which that are not even mentioned here, but some of the more important ones. It helps to prevent harm and optimize client progress. As I mentioned, a lot of the times clients do come to us at their vulnerable points. And so we want to prevent any harm as well, make sure that they receive the best services. Other reason is boundary violations can disrupt therapy, as I mentioned, undermine treatment progress, as well as healing. That sometimes takes a long time for folks to even reach out, right? When we look at the literature and the statistics, when we talk to service users, often it takes months or years for them to reach out. So you don't want to harm that and that trust. Often boundary violations take advantage of clients' dependence and trust, which can be traumatic or re-traumatic for clients. And what we know about prevalence of trauma is it's so common in our society, and we need to be really mindful of not re-traumatizing clients or traumatizing them in the first place. That is definitely counterintuitive, counterproductive to what we do as helpers. Other consequences of boundary crossings and violations for clients include creating confusion for the client. And this was mentioned in other sessions, if you were a part of it earlier on today. Client not knowing, what's happening because they're often preoccupied with crises or other things going on as well. Now there's this additional confusion that's created, which can be a whirlwind for a lot of folks. An important one, I think, also discussed earlier is distrust of clinicians or mistrust of other professionals in general, because I've seen that happen a lot, right? And unfortunately, when that happens, people are very reluctant to reach out for support, right? When they trust this professional that they've kind of, opened up to and shared with on many levels now, breach that trust, that going back to kind of other healthcare professionals as well can be quite hard for folks. And already mentioned around traumatization or re-traumatization of clients can create fear. It can create rage, guilt, lots of self-blame, lots of questioning. Did I do something wrong? Was it me? And in most cases, if not 100%, no. Right? Not the client, because we're the ones who have the power, and we need to be mindful of how we use our power. It can also create cognitive distortion, emotional turmoil. A huge one is isolation, just withdrawal, right? As well as disruption to supports and services. So why is it important for clinicians or practitioners to maintain boundaries? Well, it provides a therapeutic structure allowing practitioners and clients to define their roles and expectations, right? And I like to do this actually in the first session within the first half an hour, 40 minutes. I've made it a practice. It's now become a habit, right? Where I cover confidentiality, limits to confidentiality, you know, the whole informed consent process, this being part of it. What is my role? What am I able to do? What am I not able to do? And I'll get into some specifics that really helps. As well provides a foundation to foster a therapeutic relationship based on safety and trust and service users' belief that practitioner will always act in my best interest as a service user, right? That trust is really important. Promotes health and well-being of practitioners as well. So, you know, putting in boundaries around when you're going to respond to phone calls, when you're going to respond to emails. And a lot of discussion around boundaries is not only our intention as practitioners, but being mindful of how that's interpreted by the service user, because there could be a lot of misconception around that as well. Other consequences. Of course, a huge one is loss of peers, professional relationships. So, you know, people looking down on violations and trusts being breached in many ways. Practitioners have less time for, you know, their personal lives, for themselves, for family, for friends and loved ones when, you know, you don't draw boundaries. It can lead to burnout, which is quite a problem for us. A huge one that a lot of times folks may not be so cognizant of, but it's an important one, is coworker frustrations or coworkers feeling upset because we're not setting boundaries, right? So I've had many situations where a client is a new client and will say, you know, are you going to give me your personal number? Because if I'm in crisis, I got to reach out to someone. And I know that for some agencies, you know, that may work. It depends on your role and context. For us, that doesn't work well because I may not be available to support at 11:30 at night or midnight, or I might not even be in town and, you know, have access to Wi-Fi and you know, to get a hold of me. So I always like to build in a contingent plan to reach out for supports, other folks in the family, community, when there's a situation of crisis. And of course, less job satisfaction, because when you don't have boundaries as well, it can affect, you know, your work. It's ongoing and continuous in a lot of ways. It doesn't seem to end. And of course, in a lot of situations, potentially folks can lose their jobs or loss of registration as well, which is quite impactful because we work so hard, go through many trainings and programs, and just, you know, to have that revoked, so much of it is tied into our personal identities, and it's a huge consequence. So some of the main boundary issues in clinical work, as I said, I talked about some of the more important ones. Of course, touch is a huge one. So things like hugging clients, and this goes back again to the context of the work that you're doing in the agency, and the culture of the agency makes a difference too. So I have students that, you know, are working in the context of palliative care, and, you know, the compassion touch is different, and it's a cultural organizational practice. But again, I think I'll speak to touch after. Knowing the prevalence of trauma, we need to be really mindful of touch and how people can interpret that touch. And also the safety and comfort of individuals could be breached as well by just, you know, a touch. So it's a huge deal. Time is another boundary issue. So hours of operation or response time to messages. This is something I love to talk to folks about at the beginning of the first session, right? I don't respond to emails or phone calls on the weekend or Sundays, whatever those boundaries are, talking about that. And out of those boundaries, where can they get support? Because it's going to come up, right? So those are really important discussions in the beginning, as well as space. I mean, in the virtual world, this changed so much, right? But also space in terms of, proximity. And are you, too close to someone? And could that be a violation of that personal space of theirs? Also, location. Are you seeing folks in the office, in the community, at the coffee shop, at the client's home? Every agency, has different guidelines. For us, it's keeping it in the office or keeping it to virtual platform, but just being mindful again, and sometimes just having those conversations with colleagues to kind of say, this has come up, right? For example, I've had young people say, I don't want to be in this office space. Can we walk outside? I just want to go sit on the bench and just be in nature, right? So is that acceptable? Is that not acceptable? Like thinking ahead, right? That's important. Gifts. Gifts is actually a common topic that we talk about. And some of these things I also like to include in our welcome letter, where folks read, aside from that discussion and conversation first session, to know that we cannot accept gifts, and if gifts are still shared, we're gifted with things, we like to share it with the staff, right? Put in the staff room and share that. And finally, self-disclosures, right? Disclosure of personal information and, just taking over the session, dominating the session. And I'm going to go in depth, like around self-disclosure and other pieces. I'll go in depth and share some other considerations a little bit later on. And of course, virtual practice was a new phenomenon, relatively new phenomena for us, most of us, when the pandemic hit. Virtual practice presents a number of other considerations, some of which we've figured out, and a lot of others we're still figuring out, right? So it's an ongoing process. So some considerations here is establishing privacy and safety within the virtual space. That's really important. I learned that just having discussions around safety and who's around, right? Who's at home? Who can overhear you? Are you safe? Is there a code word that, that we can have so that if you're not safe and, and safe in a sense, not always in a context of violence, but just safe because you don't want your personal information to be overheard. As well, having those discussions around safety planning in place, aside from, things like having a safe word and what to do if the individual is not feeling safe. Like I found this to be such a common issue around practice where clients were logging in. I still have this in virtual practice when I see clients, and they might be at a park or at a beach having a good time, right? But who's around? Who can overhear you, right? These are discussions that for some of us are new, right? And one of the major things that I had to adopt in my practice was to create a mini questionnaire. For example, I did not see couples that were considered high conflict virtually because I found it to be a safety issue. And I wasn't there, I wasn't present, I felt very troubled. happened once or twice, and there was a lot of intervention and a lot of connecting and providing resources, right? So those are the important topics that we didn't think too much about, here and there, but important these days for sure. Establishing a contingency plan with client in case you're not available. So I always like to go to the immediate kind of circle. Who's in the family? Who's in the community? Who's available to support? And then kind of work outwards, right? Emergency contacts, other programs and services that are also available for folks to reach out to in case. So, discussing work hours. So, when do you see clients? What days of the week? What are your hours? Just because you're virtual, it doesn't mean that you're available to folks. And I've had a lot of times in the beginning, I had to kind of have, discussions with clients to kind of say, I understand that you're in crisis, and I understand that, you need supports. It's just that we need to be mindful of what my working hours are. Another really important thing that I found to come up a lot is discussing your wait time in cyberspace for clients, believe it or not, because so many times you log in and you connect and you're waiting there and they might not show up. How long do you wait, right? So having those discussions early on actually is important. And I tell clients, as a part of that informed consent, my rule of thumb is that I stick around about 15, 20 minutes. If you're not connected, then we need to reschedule, right? Because I've had situations where folks logged in 25, half an hour into it, and they were really upset because I wasn't there present for the session. So, which is understandable, but that's an important discussion. Oh, a huge one is response time to emails and messages, right? And just, I love this because I think that it sets up the framework for individuals to keep in mind. Ozzy is available at this time, but then I need to get a hold of her because there might be that, lag in response time that it might take. I don't get my emails live. I'm in session a lot of the times. So having those discussions, I also think is really important. The other piece I think that helps a lot is having auto replies or responses with emergency contacts. I also have that in my signature as well, just in case, letting folks know that, there might be a delay in getting a response from us. That's important. So other considerations that have been an issue in-person practice, but virtually I find more and more, are things like substance use in session, right? Traditionally, I've never had a client in person say, is it okay if I vape in session? But I've had many times that folks ask, I'm in a virtual session, do you mind if I vape? As well as other things like appropriate attire, right? What not to wear, what feels uncomfortable, what is appropriate. These are very complex as well as difficult conversations to have, but yet I think is important and a part of skill building for us as professionals as well as potentially service users. So having safe encrypted platforms, I hear a lot of stories about, folks using generic, Hotmail or Gmail or things like that, and just being mindful of, encrypted, private information being encrypted, but also using platforms that are encrypted as well, and, making sure, following guidelines. Sometimes, things like using a landline is much more effective than maybe a cell phone that can be intercepted, and just other considerations. Of course, if we have time, I love to hear from folks around additional considerations, maybe just before Q&A, if we do have the time, because it's a learning opportunity, so I'd love to hear more from you. And social media is a huge, huge topic in our profession, right? Historically, I didn't have to think about social media and having a presence on social media. But in our modern world, it's important to consider how professional and personal online presence might impact the therapeutic relationship. So some practitioners heavily rely on social media. That's a platform to do outreach, to connect with the community, to reach the community. A lot of folks may not have access to cell phones or other resources. So being mindful of your professional presence and separating the personal and the professional. I love to have things like, even on social media, to have, a pop-up message or whatever, it depends on the platform you're using, to kind of say, please don't share any private information. Please be mindful that this is a public platform, and raising awareness or reminding folks. Taking reasonable care to separate and maintain distinction between our personal and professional presence on social media could be really important, because I've seen cases where there's a lot of miscommunication or misunderstanding when, a service user reaches out to you through social media platform and says, can I be your friend? And what does that mean? And having those discussions with folks, right? Not to say, stay away from it, but actually engage. And what does that mean? And how is that useful? And what are the boundaries around that? If possible, include explicit messages and disclaimers. So if you're in a crisis, please do not DM us. Instead, email to book an appointment, etc., and have resources in your auto reply. Super helpful. Other considerations for practitioners is, as I mentioned, important message is practitioners are ultimately responsible for managing boundary issues at the end of the day. It doesn't matter what the client did or didn't do, said, didn't say. At the end, the onus falls on us, and valid so, right? We are the professionals. Might be helpful to bring up relevant boundary issues in informed consent, as I mentioned. I like to, as mentioned previously, always put it in writing in the welcome letter, but because often people just skim through it or may not be cognizant of what they're signing, I like to bring that piece in the informed consent discussion. But again, this is an ongoing conversation, because a lot of times folks are there, especially first session, evaluating us, just going through, what can I share, what can I not share? And it's hard to retain everything. So with repetition and bringing that up, I think it's quite helpful. Importance of ongoing and explicit discussions and communication boundaries with clients, and engaging in reflexivity and being self-aware of boundary issues unique to individual clients, because often there is no formula that we have. There's certain formulas that we have, but it can get complex, right? So reflexivity and carving out time for reflexivity, because I've learned over practice that you actually need to do that. You need to carve out time and reflect, about sessions, your behavior, as well as kind of the process. Regularly asking whose needs are being met, clients or mine? I love that question, because that helps to refocus my work, right, and position me as a professional. consulting with peers and supervisors. And I feel that we need more and more of this because we are so connected as social workers, but sometimes we work in silos, right? It can be isolating too. So opportunities for consultation and engagement, bouncing off ideas is quite helpful. And engaging in continuous education. I love that because it's this profession is about learning. It doesn't end, right? The learning continues, and that's the beauty of it. Thinking ahead, especially when entering dual relationships, and possibly avoiding them whenever possible. Maintaining documentation, documenting details around boundary issues. And going back to the other speakers in earlier sessions, I think that aside from consult, the other message is document, 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 and document all the details, because if you're a busy person, I'm sure a lot of us are, you do forget details. So that piece is really important for me. So just some specifics around self-disclosure. Self-disclosure, just so we're all on the same page, refers to sharing of information about yourself or your own experience with clients or service users. So when deciding on the appropriateness of personal disclosure in a therapeutic relationship, think about the purpose. For me, that's a real guide, right? Why am I doing this? Why am I sharing this? What is the intention or the purpose behind it? Using I statements and not generalizing, because that's my experience. It's not, everyone that's had a similar experience. Sharing briefly and being mindful not to dominate the session, because it's about the service user, and being mindful that it's not about us, and kind of gauging in that way is appropriate. And being appropriate and sensitive to your sharings and how your sharing may come across, right? I always love to check in. First of all, one thing is asking for permission. Is it okay if I share? Not assuming that people are okay to hear our stories and experiences. So that permission piece is huge. But also, in terms of sensitive or appropriate content, when sharing, I always like to close off with, how was that for you? Tell me, what was that like for me to share that piece and get their feedback? And self-disclosure should only be used for the benefit of clients, never for our own benefit, right? Shifting gears a little bit to gifts, at times clients may wish to gift their counselors or therapists on a special occasion and or at the end of therapy. Sometimes it's even a cultural practice. It's a beautiful gesture, but again, going back to misuse of power, as well as, what's acceptable and what is the message that, that I'm relaying to other folks, as well as legality and our agency policy too. So some considerations here. Depending on the value of the gift and the agency policy, you may or may not be able to accept the gifts. So again, having that discussion at the onset. Often expensive gifts or monetary gifts are not permitted for valid reasons, right? It can be exploitative in nature. Ideally, make the policy clear from the onset in an attempt to avoid any disappointment, awkwardness, because it can be quite awkward or disappointing for the service users that, are sharing the gifts and, good intentions. As well, refer to your agency guidelines as mentioned and policies around receiving gifts. So some of this was already mentioned around out-of-session contact, but practitioners may offer clients communication options outside the session. So things like phone, text, email contact. For us, we, even in our informed consent and permission form, we, aside from the welcome letter, we have a specific area where we want folks to initial that we do not want you to text or expect a text from us in response, because I don't know who's on the end of the phone, on the other end of the phone, and it can violate your confidentiality and your privacy. Discuss any out of contact, session contact, the amount of contact, response to contact, inquiries, safety planning in the event therapists cannot be reached. And importantly, super importantly, do not surprise clients with fees attached to out-of-session contact, because sometimes I've heard of stories where people say, I wasn't aware if I request supports through the phone that I'll be charged for it. So being mindful of that piece. And also being mindful to handle changes in the therapeutic framework with care, as it can be quite unsettling for folks. So being as sensitive and compassionate as possible. Some guidelines around touch. So some clinicians offer hugs or other forms of touch as a part of the therapeutic relationship. Of course, this often depends on your role, work setting, and something that helps, but not always, you gotta kind of consult, is adapt the agency culture. So if I'm working in a palliative care kind of setting, and the culture of the agency is that we do offer compassionate touch, that it's across board practice. Any intervention involving touch should be handled diligently and sensitively. And of course, reflect in supervision about the purpose and the value of touch. Super important. If incorporating touch, important to have ongoing dialogue with service users about the therapeutic meaning of touch to help avoid any misunderstanding and ensure safety and comfort in the room, in the space, virtual space sometimes. And this is especially important for clients that have experienced relational trauma, physical, sexual abuse, or violations. And I see this over and over again. And an important message on this, before I move on, is touching of a sexual nature is never permitted under no circumstances and no conditions. Dual relationships. So when the clinician and client are engaged in another relationship or interaction aside from the role of the helper service user, can become a dual relationship. So dual relationships can manifest in a number of ways. So your contractor can become your client, or your hairdresser can become your client. Client attends shared faith, congregation, maybe a shared hobby, club or group. So being mindful of trying as much as possible to avoid dual relationships. And dual relationships can pose a risk of harm to clients and should be avoided, as I mentioned, if possible. So just some brief points about time, number, sessions, and location. So practical boundaries relevant to therapeutic relationships are important to discuss explicitly. Again, these are important conversations, and to bring them into the session is important. And we kind of talked about the other pieces around, frequency of sessions offered, mode of delivery, fees for sessions, and process of payment. Importantly, whether the work is open-ended or if it's time-limited, because there could be a lot of misconception around that as well. When boundaries are crossed, a few things that might be helpful is mitigate harm wherever, whenever possible, and ethical, inform supervisor, and take the situation to supervision, as well. If it involves a student, inform the educational institutions, because I've been a part of that as well, and I know that's important. inform the professional or regulatory body if needed, depending on the situation. It's hard to say, but consult. So clear professional boundaries create safety for both clients and practitioners and help us establish the role of practitioners and service users. Interestingly enough, the other piece that, as I was hearing the different talks throughout the day, was I never really thought about it, but the economic cost to a lot of us, right? It can be by savoring and protecting our profession, but also we heard about the rise in hearings and investigations as well. So it does in a lot of ways benefit all of us. But most importantly, that trust should not be violated because we hold very sacred positions, right? And it's very humbling, but yet we need to keep that in mind. So just wanted to thank you. And thank you. Hope I've left you with some food for thought.
Lots of food for thought. I'm wondering, can I be heard? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, Ozzie. There have been some interesting comments percolating in the chats here, and many of the things that you've discussed, in particular, this notion of giving gifts. There have been some comments around, whether cards are acceptable. Also, as you pointed out, the cultural element to that, where in some cultures giving gifts or food is a part of the relationship, and to refuse to accept that might be viewed as rude, and how do you navigate that? As well as individuals noting that what gifts they can accept are dictated by the policies of their organization that they follow to make sure that there is no confusion around that. There is a question, I'm just trying to scroll to find it here. Let me just, one registrant commented on, and perhaps you can comment on this, that it's hard when another coworker, colleague has set a tone with a client, giving them hugs, for example, and then you now have to try to set the boundary with that client and are kind of viewed as the bad guy. Any comments on that?
Yeah, that's difficult. That's a difficult one, and that's the one I was referring to, right? And I've been in situations where I've had to kind of explain, it's a part of the professionalism and our code of ethics, and not for the individual to personalize it or internalize it or misunderstand and think it comes from a bad place or a negative place, but in fact, a place of good intention and for the protection of the individual. But that is a difficult one, and that's something that we need to be cognizant of, right? Boundaries we set with individuals.
Absolutely. And by the way, I should note lots of comments thanking you for a wonderful presentation and a very timely and important topic. There is a question that I wanted to scroll down to. Let me just try to find it here. I appreciate that Sarah Chowdhury was much more skilled at doing this than I am. So let me try to find the question. Here's a question. Can you speak to the concept of dual relationships and how it applies to when both relationships are social work, service user, but in different contexts or agencies? Are there different considerations compared to other dual relationship situations in which one relationship is not a professional one in nature? Let me read it back to you.
Yeah,
Can you speak to the concept of dual relationships and how it applies to when both relationships are social worker / service user, but in different contexts or agencies? ?
I'm not sure what they mean by both are.
I wonder if that registrant can maybe rephrase the question and post again, just so that we understand. Sure. We can kind of come back to you. Let me move on. There was another question that I'm trying to find now that was dealing with, how do you deal with situations where, here it is. I would like to hear about some of those boundary issues when it comes to working with clients who have been raped, who've experienced, issues related to war crimes, etc. How surface or how deep can you or should you be with the questions that you ask of these clients? recognizing that they may have some personal boundaries around these things that have happened to them, these experiences. How much is too much or too little?
Absolutely. Well, we know that you don't necessarily need to, in a therapeutic context, you don't need to speak about the traumatic event to process the trauma. And I always love to check in with individuals to see, it's an individual question to see where they're at, right? Are they feeling comfortable? And I always let folks know at the onset, if there's anything that I do ask you, you don't need to answer if it feels uncomfortable. So if it feels safe, feels good to talk about it, then I welcome it. And there are no repercussions, right? If, sometimes folks might feel, oh, this is awkward because my clinician is asking me something, so I'm bound to respond. Absolutely not. There's many things I may ask that doesn't feel right to you for whatever reason, and it's your right to say, I pass, or I want to end the session, or I just don't want to engage in this conversation anymore. So having that regular check-in and asking if folks are okay with it, onset and ongoing, right? As well, I think a part of it is being able to, and we're so well-versed, read body language. I could tell when someone becomes uncomfortable, and, I might kind of say, well, I noticed that, this might be a sensitive topic, or, I'm not sure if you want to go into it further because I noticed, you kind of got a bit rigidy or uncomfortable or closed off. So having that intuitive piece as well is important.
Mm-hmm. Another question here. Supervising and mentoring students is an important topic as well. In this role, the student may be needy, may need advice, guidance, support. Do you provide a similar orientation to students around this concept of boundaries? And just curious to hear your thoughts about mentoring and supporting and boundaries and guidelines in that context.
Yes, I do actually. I in my role as supporting MSW students in clinical supervision, there's been many discussions around boundaries. It's an important topic, and it's unfortunate, but you actually find that in the context of boundaries being violated by supervisors, towards students doing placements and things like that as well. Mm-hmm. But it's an ongoing issue for me anyways, as a part of professional development. And it just doesn't end when, you end being a student. As long as you're a professional, it's an ongoing discussion, really.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Some registrants are commenting on, as you pointed out in your presentation, the challenges around social media. One registrant noting social media is a tough one. I've had clients in the past ask me if they can friend me on Facebook. Always decline politely and professionally, of course, but it's a challenge because many clients will take that personally if you say, I can't accept your friend post, or I'm sorry, what is it called? Your request, sorry, I'm showing my age here.
Yeah, it is, and I call myself a tech dinosaur because I'm last to hop on that social media bandwagon, but really an important discussion for our agency as well to have, right, with clients. What are your boundaries? What are the things that, if you're connecting to our agency Facebook or Instagram, what is okay to share, what is not, and just being mindful of sharing some other experiences, obviously protecting privacy and confidentiality, but as a learning piece as well to bring that up, right?
Some registrants are commenting on, again, consultation being important. One registrant noting that one of their colleagues had an issue. It was discussed at the peer supervision group to resolve the issue. So reflecting, I guess, on the concept of ensuring that you consult.
Yes.
And peer supervision being an important tool in that regard. Just scrolling down to see if I've missed. Okay. Okay. Do you have it in front of you? Sure. Oh, hang on. I think I saw it. Sorry here. Okay. This may be a reframing of the question that I asked earlier. Can you speak to the concept of dual relationships and how it applies to when, is that the same, am I reading the same question? Okay, so sorry, I can't find it right now, but do you have it?
Sorry, I hope everyone can hear me okay. So I think the registrant clarified about the dual relationships, referring to when the social worker and the client are involved professionally in two different contexts. So for example, one-to-one therapy in one place and as a group facilitator in another. There's two relationships, both are professional, but they're occurring in two different contexts. So could you speak to if there's any dual relationship considerations in that regard?
It's hard to say. It really depends on the agency and your role, but I can see that happening because in a therapeutic context, you really are privy to more private information, confidential information, whereas in a group format, you may not be. And where do you draw the boundary? And again, an important discussion to have with the service user or client to kind of say, yes, you know, I am in this role as a group facilitator and then in this role as a practitioner. Whether that's allowed or not really depends on so many different considerations. But if it is an agency practice and it's acceptable to definitely engage in those discussions and draw those boundaries around, you know, what to share in the group, what not to share, you know, just to be clear and both be on the same page, I think is important.
Another question here. What if the head of an agency starting a new practice that goes against ethics? For example, the head of this new agency is not asking for clients' permission to have, you know, third parties assist in the counseling session, you know, impinging upon a client's boundaries and privacy. You know, what can be done, or do you have any comments on that?
I go based on our regulatory body, right, and what they stipulate. And we have a responsibility as professionals, you know, to adhere to our code of ethics and standards of practice. So it goes beyond the supervisors and the CEO and the executive director. And at times like this, you know, honestly, one of the best resources is the college. Mm-hmm. I find them to be quite supportive and very informative, so to consult as well.
Looking through the questions, there's some similar questions. I think there's one more, and perhaps after this question, I believe you might have had an exercise that you might want to engage registrants in. There might be time for that sure. Following this question. What advice would you give peer support workers regarding boundaries and self-disclosure?
That's a tough one, right? But I would say similar practices, because a lot of this discussion is for the protection of, you know, service users. And even as peer support folks, I think that, you know, the power dynamics are different. And, you know, I've been in that role, and you do still have more power. And you need to be mindful of your power and how you're using it or misusing it as mm-hmm. well, right? So similar conversations, I would say.
Great. I think, and again, many of the comments again are thanking you for a fabulous presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Did you want at this time, Ozzy, to...
I don't know if we have time, but I was just curious if there are other sharings, folks online around, you know, strategies or, you know, tools that they've implemented that's been effective around boundaries. Many of what we talked about, and maybe some that we haven't covered, so that we can share and it be a learning opportunity for all of us. If we have time, that would be great.
So it would be great if individuals have something to share on that, if they could share in the chat, and I can read that out. So please feel free to let us know what strategies you may have used or you are using that may not have been discussed today that might be helpful to others in their practice. And I'll be happy to read those out as well. In the meantime, are there any questions from anyone in the room? And I'm going to ask if I can give you the mic.
Thank you, and thank you for a wonderful talk and an opportunity to refresh. it never ends. You're absolutely right. You know, some dual relationships happen without the intent. So if you live in a small town or in a smaller community, you end up, you know, being the therapist of your kids' hockey, you know, the coach of your kids' hockey team, and so on and so forth. That's tricky. What do you recommend?
That's a tricky one, right? Because of lack of resources, access to resources, and you are so many folks that I talk to, you're such an important part of the community a lot of the times, and the resource in the community. So of course they cannot be avoided for various situations. If possible, I mean, one benefit of virtual for those that of course have access to Wi-Fi and technology is if you're not able to, you know, provide in-person supports because of geography, then you can tap into virtual services. Sometimes that's helpful, but again, consultation with peers. Because I find boundary issues, you know, with small piece of information, so much can change, right? And so it's a contextual discussion, and I think that it should be an ongoing discussion with colleagues, supervisors on, you know, on the team as well. But you're absolutely right. It is challenging for a lot of communities because of lack of service providers.
And Ozzie, just sharing some of the comments to the question you posed of registrants. One registrant says, I always cover in the first session what we will do if we meet in public, right?
Yes.
Right, that's very helpful. Another registrant has said, I have a no hugging policy. Handshakes or high fives are okay though. Another registrant has indicated, when mentoring BSW, MSW students, I usually block them on social media until their placement is done as a way to ensure that there is no crossing of boundaries.
Very good.
That's one strategy used by one registrant. Let's see here, another. With respect to gifts, I think this is a question. With respect to gifts, I was given roses from one of my clients, and I shared with him that I appreciated the gesture, but I couldn't accept the generous gift. I asked him if it would be okay to leave the flowers for the house so that everyone could enjoy them, and I also reminded them of the professional relationship and the need to maintain that professional relationship. One question here that was posed by a registrant: what do you think about some agencies that allow workers to outreach clients in informal settings like parks, parties, group homes? They often do not see clients in offices. So I think you commented on, you know, there are some registrants whose practice is such that they might see clients outside of a therapy office per se. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's, again, for me, it depends on the agency's practice and what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. Trying as much as possible to keep it to the context of, you know, the formal context. But sometimes, you know, it's just more effective. It's hard to say, and it depends on location. It depends on the time. There's so many different considerations. If I'm, you know, walking outside with a client at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, you know, the context is very different than me taking a stroll with a client at 8 o'clock at night. Can be misunderstood outside of potentially work hours, right. So on and so forth. So it's a very complex issue, right?
Yeah. One other suggestion by registrant indicates that at their work, they have a work Facebook page that is different and separate from their personal page. No friends allowed on it, but it's for posting on the agency Facebook page. So kind of separating that out is one strategy used by one registrant. Another commenting, as you noted, first session, I have a list of things that I cover off, like public sightings, no gifts, no touching. I leverage all the 24/7/crisis mobile services regionally for part of what to do in a crisis conversation when I'm not available. So they have discussions of what resources are available should a crisis arrive and the registrant not be available. Those conversations are had up front. And let me see if there are any others. There's a comment here. Peer workers also need supervision and could consult our professional practice worker at the hospital as a hospital employee if needed, and review boundaries and self-disclosure. It's one registrant's comment. I think Haley, am I catching all of them? I think I've caught them all, which is surprising because this is quite challenging, I have to say. And again, more comments about how fabulous the presentation is.
Thank you. It's a humbling experience. I'm just so happy to be with you folks here in the room and virtually as well. Important discussion.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ozzy. Those were the last of the questions. And again, I want to reiterate the comments of our registrants in saying this was a fabulous presentation. And many of the registrants commented on how well it dovetailed with previous presentations that we've heard today. On behalf of the college, again, we want to thank you so much for your presentation this afternoon. And as a token of our appreciation, the college has made a donation to the Environmental Defense, an organization chosen by Ozzy. So important. I was thinking about last week's air quality. Very important. And this is an organization, it's a Canadian environmental advocacy organization that works with government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. Thank you, Ozzy.